Well, hello there. I'm going to try and set up the best I can for you on lighting with two cameras here. At the first I'm just going to show you the brushes and materials that I'm going to be using. Then I'm going to demonstrate some of these brushes and materials for you just to see how some of them work. Some of you may not have seen some of these particular brushes. Then I'm going to move the paper around and actually demonstrate some of the techniques I'm going to be using on this very picture, and that will make the lighting much better on this piece of paper. And finally we'll move on to the picture itself. So let's start with the materials we have here. Well, I've got two cases of brushes. I don't keep nearly as many for oils and acrylics, only a very basic set of flats and filberts and some riggers and rounds. But for watercolour I tend to use a far greater variety of techniques. So I've got a pan of watercolours here, which are the tube watercolours that I put into the pans and then let them dry, which will be exactly the same in many ways as the actual pans themselves. These are full pans here. These are the Russian paints, they're much stronger. These are more delicate Winsor & Newton watercolours, so I tend to use them for different purposes. Again, I like to be very versatile and have both mediums and methods ready for my use or whatever subject I want to do. Got some masking fluid here. I tend to favour the Pebeo masking fluid. Find it much better than any of the others. The others tend to clog up in sunshine or warmth especially and give me great problems, whereas I've never had a problem with that one as yet. Now this is an old bottle, so we'll see how it works today. Let's hope it works well for us, because we're going to need this with the techniques we're going to use. Mixing palettes, of course. And then we come to the various brushes which we're going to demonstrate now. I've got a pencil for drawing out with. I have a Chinograph pencil. I use this quite a lot for snow scenes and doing darks and twigs and so on in snow scenes. Waterproof, but lets the watercolour go onto it slightly. Again, if you watch my videos you'll see demonstrations of snow scenes using this. The magic sponges, quite useful little things. You can buy these sponges from cheap shops as well as art supplies. Exactly the same thing, and much cheaper from pound shops obviously. Hake brushes, find them very useful. Rake brushes, fan brushes, mops, round brushes, flat brushes. Some harder, some are softer, the brushes, for various reasons. Can't go into all that in this one watercolour demonstration, but I will just show you a couple of the brushes that you may not have seen. We're going to be using the rake brushes, that's these, and you can see the rake at the end here, very effective. We're going to also have a chance to use the fan brushes, that's these. We're almost certainly going to need to use a rigger. That's these long ones here for doing long fine lines, and we could even be using a sword for that work as well. And we've got knives and swords here. Now this is a knife brush. You can see how it's got a sharp end and a blade. They're quite good for doing thin lines, as are the swords, which are a much longer brush. Now the consistency of brushes is important as well. So that was a knife brush, a sword is longer. Must be in my other box because I've got another set of brushes as well for England. I keep this set for France, but I manage with those. And these particular brushes are quite a stiff consistency. I've got flats in those as well, and they're very useful for doing dry brush work and very loose work. So the stiffer the brush, the more it goes over the surface. The softer the brush, the more it goes into the surface, which is where my oval mops come in handy, and that's one of my favourite brushes because, like Ron Ransom, between these or a hake and a fine round brush like a rigger, I can do almost an entire painting. We're going to be using that today, so I will need a mop today, I'll need the rigger today, and I may use a fan and a rake as well. That's probably all I'm going to actually need, or I might need a small round as well. So if I were to just demonstrate what marks those will make and how we can use them, just quickly for you, that might give you a better idea, wouldn't it? But before I start demonstrating with the brushes, I'm just going to put a little bit of masking fluid onto my paper so that it has time to dry out whilst I'm doing the brush demonstration. So I'll just put a whole series of textures on using this sharpened point of this bit of paintbrush here. You can use stick, you can use special applicators which have hollow needles, you can use clay shapers which has rubber points, and I'll just drag out and draw and dot and dash with a few of these to give an idea of the sort of textures we can get. Let that dry off, then we'll see how the paint will go over that afterwards. So this is a rubber masking fluid that when it's dry should rub off. We don't rub it off of course until we finish the painting. As I say, this Pebeo I find is quite good because it hasn't given me problems in the past with heat. I have found that many of the other brands that I shan't mention tend to gel and stick onto the paper and become impossible to get off later on and ruin your painting. So we'll let that dry for the moment, and let's go back to the brushes now. Now I mustn't touch that masking fluid whilst it's drying. Certainly mustn't put paint over it, or it will get into the brush and it messes the brush up, and of course make a total mess of the demonstration as well. What I will do next is to take my little rake brush. I'm just going to take, just for fun, doesn't matter what colour really, a little bit of red, just to show you what a rake will do, and you can see the lines you can get with it immediately. So if we're doing something like reeds or rushes, you can see we could get that, or we can texture with it and use little dots and dashes to get the tips of reeds and rushes or grasses. Now you can get these in different thicknesses of the rake. You can get fine rakes, you can get heavy rakes, but again, for use of the rushes and reeds in the side here, this is going to be very useful in this particular painting, or we can do it for the little dots and dashes. So that's a rake brush. We will now move to a hake rather than a rake. This is a smaller hake, and the reason I like the hakes is because we can do a wash. I'm going to take just a little bit of green and just wash it onto there. So a wash is our first coat of just water and paint. A glaze would be a second coat over that when it's dry. And we can drop into that another colour. So this is wet into wet. Or we can drop into it another colour and drop a colour next to it so that it runs in. So this is wet next to wet and wet on wet. And that would be wet on dry. Now if I use the brush lightly, not too much paint, you can see we get a dry brush effect. So we can get the sparkling of water there, which we might want on our painting as well. And if I make the brush a little more broken by just pressing on it like that, I can get lovely broken effects with the brush. So I'll deliberately, the older the rake for this, the better. If I deliberately break up my rake at the end, I can get textures and little rushes and reeds and so on with that as well. Make it a bit darker so you can see it. And you can see how we can use the tip of the rake to get those lovely textures, or we can stipple as well like this. So that's a so that's a hake brush. Leaving the hake brush, we'll go to a fan. Again, I'll take a little bit of blue and we'll look what we can do with a fan brush. And again, we can break it up more to make textures. And different fan brushes have different effects. We could use that this way up for making fir trees look. Put some green on there. We'll do a couple of fir trees so I can come round like that. Make the effect of fir trees, or we can have pine trees by bringing the branches across. Talking of thin lines, you can use both the sword and the rigger for doing thinner lines. So I can paint a thin line with a rigger, quite a long thin line, just by dragging it through. So very useful for thin lines, but also both the daggers and the swords are useful for thinner lines. Rigger for doing fine lines, or you can use a dagger or a sword for doing fine lines. So I find these daggers very useful for figures as well, because I find them very versatile. So for instance, if I want to just flick a couple of figures in, I can use this to make quick forms and twist the brush so that I can get it either flat like that, or I can use just a tip. And let's just have a couple of figures walking here like this. So you can see how quickly we can just build something up there, even with a few strange colours. But the daggers had this lovely advantage of being able to be twisted and used at different angles. So I didn't use proper figure colours there. I just wanted to give you an idea. So swords, daggers, rakes, and now going to my flats. If we want to use a flat, as I said, they're very good for dry brush work as well. If we want a square hole, use a square brush. So if I want to make a square shape, I can use a square brush. If I want a window, for instance, I can do 1, 2, 3, 4, and there's a window. But equally, they're great for doing dry brush work. They can just be dragged across to give reflections and so on, as with that figure there, for instance. I just do a couple of bits of dry brush work there with a flat. It's a fairly stiff flat, and that's why it will give me good dry brush work. Just very quickly, just a few techniques here, because we're going to be using these techniques shortly. And finally, one of the most useful brushes I find is the oval mop. That's this one. I find this so useful, it's like a hake, because I can paint with it thickly, with a thick line like that. You can see I can leave a dry brush there if I want to. or I can use a lot more paint on it, and because it's a soft brush I can paint in depth into here quite well. So a nice soft brush for doing wet into wet or wet next to wet. Look at those lovely effects we can get. So again, wet into wet. Or I can do it dry brush. If I dry the brush off, I can take some paint and just drag across lightly. A very versatile brush indeed. We're using today a Bockingford rough paper of about £300, so quite heavy, and I'm actually using an expensive sheet here to demonstrate for you. Now this masking fluid has dried, so if we come across to that masking fluid now, I'll just show you what's going to happen when we do these white flowers of the streamer weed in the water. If I now take some blue across that, let's just take a little bit of light green and then some blue, you'll see this grey masking fluid being left behind. Could have reflections into that as well. Now we'll let that dry off, and then I'm going to rub away the masking fluid to really give you an idea of how that will stand out, how these flowers will stand out. Okay. So the techniques we're going to be using today are wet on dry. This is where we paint our colour onto dry paper and it stays hard edged. We're going to paint wet next to wet, which blends one colour into another. So if I take some red now and paint that next to that, I've got the paper at a slight angle, you see one colour coming into another. We're going to paint wet into wet, so I'm putting that paint directly into there. We're going to be glazing, so I'm going to be using a colour, I'll use a bit of yellow at the minute, and we'll let that dry, and then if I put another colour over it, that's going to change the colour and make it not only another colour, if I use a different colour, but also darker. So we'll just let that dry off a second. Whilst that's drying, and we only need these brushes as I've shown you to do this painting. I don't think I'll be using any others. What I might do though, I may use a bit of sponge. And we haven't discussed sea sponge yet, but obviously different textures of sponges are going to give us different textures on our paper. If I take a little bit of paint now, mix it in one of my palettes, that lucky green will do over there, lucky purple green from previously. If I take a little bit of that paint now on the end of my sponge, and you can see we can get lovely textures with a sponge as well, and we can get those textures with various different brushes too. Again, we're going too advanced, but that could be useful to us today. We might get a little bit of that on the trees, and we can do that with different colours as well. You don't have to just stick to one colour. We can do our techniques of wet into wet and wet next to wet, even using the sponge. So I can put one colour into and over another for trees by using that texture as well. So there's a few different techniques, just a few that we're going to use today with this painting I'm going to show you. This oval mop, it's a beautiful brush, and its versatility. Remember, not only can we paint thickly that way, we can also paint thin lines with it. So I find these so very versatile. It's not quite as textural as the hake, which we can do more broken stippling brushwork with, but I can use it that way or this way to drop in colours, and I find that the mop is one of my main watercolour brushes. So I'll definitely be using the mop, and I could almost do the entire painting with this mop. Right, let's run through these techniques we've done then. We've done the oval mop, which gives you lovely washes and graduated wash effects as well as glazing. We've done the stippling with a sponge and with a rake brush. We've done the fan brush, and we've done also some paint here ready to glaze. So I'm going to take finally a little bit of orange just to show you about glazing. I'm going to take a little bit of red now and just glaze over that, and this would be a glaze. So that red now makes orange. If I take that red on its own up here, quite a different colour altogether. So one colour over another is like stained glass and gives you an effect of mixing those colours. So red and yellow make orange as a glaze. Sometimes it's better to drop one colour into another to give a brighter effect. I'll just show an example of that. If I wanted a much brighter orange, if I took my yellow and put some red into that rather than mixing it, it makes a much nicer colour. So here, just for fun, just to show you that technique, here's some yellow. Now I'm going to take some red and drop that in, and look at the lovely bright colour we get. if I mix the two together beforehand, it gives me a much deader colour. So it's a much brighter colour when you drop one into another. Just a little trick for you to remember. I've got lots of tricks we can give you. They're in my other videos, and I'll produce more as we go along. Right, leaving that aside, we'll finally go back up here to our masking fluid and just rub that away, because that's what we're going to be doing in the actual painting. You can use your finger or you can use a cloth. And yes, the masking fluid's working all right here. It's never let me down. And look how that gives those light effects. To get the light effects, we can either do dry brush as we did over here to leave the white sparkling through. We can use masking fluid, or we can put white gouache or even acrylic on afterwards. It doesn't quite give that same sparkle, but it's still very effective. Now I'm going to go on to drawing out the actual picture, and we'll make a start on it. Though I might demonstrate some of the areas in between, because I was going to show you different ways of working. Let's just take a look at that very thing as an example, because I've been saying to you that there are many ways of doing any one painting. There are so many ways, not just one. And if we just take a look in this situation at how we can put these white flowers here, these ones of the streamer weed look, how can we paint those? Well, let me just show you just 3 different ways of that alone before we go on to actually do the actual painting. What I'm going to do is just look at the bit of streamer weed just here, and we'll do that in about 3 different ways. First of all, I'll do the masking fluid technique. We'll put these little white dots in here, which we're going to do later on the actual thing, and we'll get the little bits of white flower by using white dots of masking fluid for the streamer weed, lines as well as dots that are breaking up. And this is what we're going to do on the actual painting. And over here I'll do a different way, and over here I'll do a different way. So whilst that's drying, I'm just going to take my oval mop, and down here I'll just drop in with dry brush work a little bit of yellow and the light greens, just to get the feeling of how we can do these flowers, leaving the light behind just over the surface. Look, if I take the green now, not too much paint on my brush, don't want much paint on my brush for this, but quite strong paint, and I do use it, so quite dry, just dragging over the surface here, and we can just leave little bits of white showing in between in a moment. Now dry that brush right out, and I can just drag that through this way and that way to leave behind little bits of white there. Look, you can see. So dragging it across there gives me the dry brush area there, look. And again, if I take some deeper colour so you can see it better, just dragging it across, leaving those light areas behind. So that's wet into wet, and there's the dry, and there's a little flower showing, or sparkling water, whichever we wish. And I can even start to do ripples in the water that way with the tip of the brush, as I'm going to do later. So I can have the ripples of the water coming through, and we can blend those one into another. That's got to dry yet. Over here I'm going to continue this through for fun, but I'm going to see the dry brush work there now. That's when it's done lightly. If I press harder, as I'm going to do now, I will get a definite wash and no paper showing, so I'm going to be a lot harder on that deliberately. And over that I'm going to paint, you can see the sparkle there, I'm going to paint some white gouache in a minute. So we can see dry brush with white showing through, we've got the masking fluid, we've got just flat colour there going on, a little bit more dark into that just so that I can show you a bit more readily with the, and then if I dry that out I can come back over here with the dry brush again. You can see that lovely dry brush effect we get there. Look at that sparkle coming through there. Look, so there's dry brush and the sparkle, and here's the wet into wet, and no paper left at all. Even no dry brush there at all. We'll come back with some more water and just lose that completely. Look, and that one we've got to leave to dry, and I'll paint that over in just a second. Right, I'll take a little bit of white gouache. And a fine brush for fun, and using it almost pure. We want it to be quite thick, the white gouache. I don't want that red watercolour to get into it either. Take it from there, and we'll go over to our now dry paint with the white gouache, and you can see how we can put in the little white dots with that white gouache in that way. it doesn't give quite such a bright effect as we're going to get here. So we've got the little white dots left here by Drybrush, depending on the roughness of your paper. We've got white dots with white gouache. And let's go across to here now, because that should be dry enough to paint and rub out the masking fluid. Okay, here we go then. So as I was saying, there's so many ways to skin the cat. There's so many ways that we can paint one painting, so many styles and methods, and they're all going to give us totally different effects. I'll just go across my masking fluid here lightly. I can leave a bit of dry brush too if I want each side, just for sparkling the water. I want to go much deeper. I'm going to use wet into wet, wet next to wet, to get these lovely bits of, as I'm going to do later, streamer weed coming through here. So there's our weed, a bit darker still, a bit more purple say, just into here, and we'll let that flow into itself. And we'll let that dry off, and then I'll rub off that masking fluid and you'll see those light effects working there. Okay, that paint's now dry, so with a bit of luck we can rub away that masking fluid and look at the light effects we get there. So we've got the 3 different ways, and that's just 3 different techniques of many that we can use. And the same with the ways of paint, the mediums, the acrylics, the oils, the pastels and water, and all the combinations we can use of those as well. We can use watercolour with pastel, we can use water with pastel. And again, I've got many films, 600 or so on here, which will show you all these different techniques and fun things to explore.